recording tonight's tonight's program, so you can check that out later on our website too, or share it with people who might have missed tonight. But I'm really happy. We have in our audience tonight, we have a lot of longtime League of Women Voters members. We also extended an invite, of course, to our newest members, and we have a lot of new members in the audience too, and then just members of the general public too. So that's welcome, everybody. We're so glad that you're here. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the League of Women Voters St. Paul is a 101-year-old grassroots citizens organization. We practice nonpartisan political advocacy, education, and empowerment at the local level. And in St. Paul, we do this by hosting events like you're at tonight. We do voter registration, conduct outreach wherever we're asked to go. We host candidate forums, and we publish a voter guide each year. But just because we're nonpartisan doesn't mean we don't take positions on issues. We do, and you can learn more about those policy positions by visiting our website. Last November in Minnesota, I'm sure we all remember what that was like, but last November we had 1 in 5 eligible voters didn't vote. And when they were polled as to why they didn't vote, they just said that their vote didn't matter. They didn't say that they had trouble getting to the polls, or they didn't know how to vote, or face other barriers. They just said that they didn't think that their voice mattered. And, of course, at the League, we believe that making your voice heard does matter. And voting does matter, and we know this. And so here to talk to us a little bit more about that and how it all works is Professor Matthew Filner. Mr. Filner is a professor of political science. He's the former chair of the social science department, and he's currently the president of the Faculty Association at Metropolitan State University. Professor Filner holds a PhD in political science from Indiana University, and he teaches courses in constitutional law, American politics, global politics, and political philosophy. So we're so lucky to have him here tonight. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thanks, Amy, and thanks all of you for being here. It's great to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces. I wish we could be in person. There's obviously, as we're all feeling, I'm sure, not only the loss of being in person, but also the struggle of being on Zoom. I'm going to do my best to be human, to not be a machine talking to you, and I hope that you will too. That you will interrupt or raise your hand if you have questions. There's under the reactions tab, there's a way to just raise your hand electronically. And I encourage you to do that. That way I know if you have a question. And then, as Amy said, if you would prefer just simply to type in your question in the chat, and then she'll let me know if you have a question. I've designed this presentation with no prior knowledge expected. I know all of you have a lot of prior knowledge, and some of it may be in this presentation. So I encourage you to think about the prior knowledge that you have that I'm presenting on as an opportunity for you to think about how to teach it to others. If we've learned nothing from the last 5 or so years, I hope we've learned how vital it is that we're all invested in keeping our democracy strong. And part of the way we keep our democracy strong is by teaching each other what it is, what kind of system we have, and why it's so vital that people like all of you are involved in making it stronger. So think of this in part as teaching maybe something new, but also think of it as me teaching the teachers. And so you may have questions about how best to present something, or how best to encourage a conversation with your neighbors, with your friends, with other people in your community. And those will be perfectly appropriate things to ask. But again, I designed this with no expectation that there's prior knowledge. In fact, I've done presentations like this to Japanese students, to Vietnamese students, all in other parts of Asia, and they knew nothing about American politics. So we're going to start from there. Now, you should also be able to see my screen. And I think the most important starting point when thinking about American civics is the fundamental fact that we have a system of limited government. It may not always feel like government is limited. Sometimes government tries to get very involved in private issues, sometimes very involved in public issues. And some of us might want government to be less limited. We want it to be more invested and involved in both public and private issues. But when you think about limited government, or the basic principle of limited government, think about the idea of what government would be if it were truly unlimited, when there would be no way to constrain a government from doing whatever it wanted. And that, of course, was the system of government that the original founders had faced. And so the principle of limited government was really a way to constrain government powers, and the principal way to do that was through rights, individual rights, and in some sense, collective rights. This group, obviously, one of the most vital individual rights is the right to vote, and we'll talk about that right later. But you're familiar with rights, for example, to free speech, to free press, those types of rights. And those are all best understood not as something you carry with you, but rather as something that limits government. And we do this system of limited government, through what is known as federalism. And you might jot down in the chat what you think is the opposite of federalism. Why don't we just do that for a second? If you've heard the word federalism, what do you think is the opposite of federalism? Take a moment just to type in what you think is the opposite of federalism. I see authoritarianism, dictatorship, a couple other answers maybe. Local control. Anybody else want to type in a idea? The opposite of federalism is monarchy. So I would say the opposite of federalism is confederalism, a term you may not have ever heard before. But confederalism, or confederation, is an organization, a grouping of what you might consider sovereign states or sovereign institutions. So if you've ever heard of the United Nations, of which the United States is a part, every country who is a member retains its sovereignty. The UN cannot tell anybody what to do who's a member of the UN. It might try, but it can't. And the first US Constitution was a confederal system called the Articles of Confederation. And the Federalist system of government is a system in which there is a national government, but that the institutions that are a part of that national government, like state governments, maintain their own independence and, in some sense, sovereignty. And that's the kind of system we have in the United States. It's very odd to people who've never experienced a federalist system, how it works. My Japanese students who live in a nationalist system truly couldn't understand. But in the United States, we have one national government, we have 50 state governments, and we have over 89,000 local governments. And the key thing to understand about this federalist system is that these types of governments overlap. They overlap in responsibilities, and they overlap in powers. And the way I like to talk about it is that federalism in the United States runs all the way down. It's a system in which powers, some are exclusive, some are shared, and it occurs all the way down. So I'll give you one example. If you didn't drive here tonight, obviously you're probably at home. But the last time you drove, you probably drove on or you might have driven on a federal highway, a state highway, and a local road. or even highway. And that, it was seamless for you. You didn't stop and pay a fee to the federal government and then stop and pay a fee to the local government. You do sometimes in Pennsylvania, if you've ever been on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. But generally speaking, it's seamless. And there are lots of powers between the federal, the state, the local governments, where you don't even recognize that you've crossed one of those lines. And that's the key thing about a federal system of government, or a Federalist system of government. It extends all the way down. There are, however, some exclusive powers. One of the most important exclusive powers, which we just saw exercised in I think, either the largest or one of the largest ways in American history, exercised today when the federal government committed to spending $1.9 trillion. Now, people might wonder, well, where does the $1.9 trillion come from? It's not sitting in a bank somewhere, right? There aren't $1.9 trillion sitting around. Some of it is from tax revenue, but a lot of it is from the power to print money. Now, it's been a long time since the federal government actually printed that much money for the pure purpose of spending it, but the power to pass a bill of $1.9 trillion, which is borrowed, comes from the fact that the federal government can print money. The federal government can borrow because it has the power to print. Without that ability, it could not borrow at that level. And so we don't have state governments, for example, with the power to print money. And that, of course, has changed from the original founding period. Another exclusive power of the federal government is to regulate interstate or between state commerce, so trade across state lines, and international trade. You know, we don't have the state of Minnesota regulating trade with Japan or China or even Canada. Those are federal powers. The power to make treaties, conduct foreign policy, declare war, provide an army and navy, and yes, to establish a post office. Those are all unique powers of the federal government. There are also unique powers to state governments. And one of the things that trip up my students abroad was showing them my Minnesota driver's license. They could not understand why I didn't have a United States driver's license. That was, like, of all the things I taught them, one of the most shocking things was that we don't have a US driver's license. We have a passport, but we don't have driver's licenses. Lawyers, they get their license from a state. Doctors get their license from a state. Teachers get their license from a state. Licenses are issued at the state level. As well, commerce within a state is regulated by the state government. And one of the most important, if not the most important issue for the League of Women Voters, elections, is also a state issue. Now, often, probably the League and certainly I have concerns about the fact that elections aren't more nationalized because it allows the denial of the right to vote in certain places. But imagine if we had a nationalized election, how much more vulnerable we would have been to interference from from Russia in 2016 and from others who are trying to influence illegally the election. The fact that we are so decentralized in terms of elections is actually a form of protection against foreign influence and even local influence. State governments also have the power to establish local governments. And as we've seen, sometimes they have the power to take away the power of local governments, as we saw in Michigan in the Flint water crisis. They also have the power to ratify amendments to the US Constitution, which we haven't seen since the 27th Amendment. And they have the power, as we probably more than any other time in our lives have seen in the last year, to establish measures for public health and safety. And those who want the federal government to intervene to prevent a mask mandate, for example, are not recognizing the reality of federalism. This is the responsibility of state governments. I'm going to pause for a second. Amy or Heidi, is there a question in the chat, or should I keep going?
No, I don't see any questions in the
Okay,
chat. Does
all right.
anybody have a question in the audience? Um, nope, I think you're okay to
Okay, all right, I'll keep
proceed.
going and just flag me down if you want me to stop.
Okay.
So there are also shared powers, powers shared by the federal and state governments, like making and enforcing laws, like banks and corporations being chartered, spending money, as we can see through everything from unemployment, which is funded at the federal level, but actually implemented at the state level, collecting taxes, building roads, borrowing money, establishing courts. Those are all shared powers. And so we need to think about our Federalist system of government as having these three different components: exclusive powers on both the state and the federal side, and shared powers. Now, why does this matter? Well, because when you want something to be different, when you want change, if you say have a concern about election law, you need to know who has the power to establish election law. It's a state level. Lobbying the federal government to change state election law will not be effective. And so we'll be talking about how to connect our knowledge of who's responsible, who has what power, with our action for how to try to advocate for change. Now, of course, the other main area to think about when you're thinking about our system of government is the fact that we have branches to our government. And as I'm sure you learned very young, right, the three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. There's, I think, a pretty well-established way of thinking about branches as institutions that influence our political way of life. And so we ought to also think about the bureaucracy. The IRS, for example, which we'll be dealing with a lot in the next couple of months, and other institutions that are not really as clearly part of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. Although the IRS is formally part of the executive branch, it really has, in some important ways, a separate existence. The media, which has such an important influence on our lives, can function much as another branch. And then, of course, the people themselves. All of these branches of government are ways to think about at the multiple levels within our Federalist system. So as you're thinking about who is making what decision that affects your lives, and therefore who to communicate with, to lobby, to try to influence, to try to contact, it's important to be thinking about which branch of government and at which level. So the federal legislative branch we know as Congress. The state legislature is also the legislative branch, is in St. Paul. And then we also each have local city councils. We also have an executive branch, whether it's the president's, whether it's the governor, whether it's a mayor of our city. And then, of course, there are courts at the federal, state, and local level. And it's important to be thinking about which box a particular power lives in when thinking about how best to get the kind of influence that you want to have. Oops, I lost my page. I'm having a little PowerPoint meltdown here, so let me try to get this fixed.
That's okay. We understand.
It happens, right? It happens.
It does. It happens.
It doesn't want to stay on a particular page. Well, I'm not sure why, but I'm just going to keep talking.
Okay.
I did have a question about that slide you were showing with the powers of government and showing the legislative, judicial, and executive going down to the local level. How does county government fit on that chart?
County government is a local government also established at the state level. So state governments establish county and city governments. In some counties with relatively small populations, there isn't a distinction between county and city or local. So in rural Minnesota, for example, there are counties where there's a county seat, and that is, they have a mayor, that's their local government. Obviously, in the heavily populated counties like Hennepin or Ramsey County, there are very strong distinctions within that local government between, say, the what I would call the legislative branch of the county government, the county commissioners. Typically, there isn't a executive branch formally, although some counties do have a county executive who functions as an executive branch. And then, of course, there are county courts. So they would fit in the local branch because all county government is actually established at the state level. So, yeah, I see someone else has their hand raised.
Yes, hi, I'm Matt.
Hi.
And thank you for putting this on for us. Just to kind of piggyback on that, one of the things that I am wondering about is how do we find out at the local level when you talk about affecting change? Say, if you have a mayor of one city who has oversight, I'll just use a hot button topic for right now, say the police department in one city, but in another city, it's not necessarily the power doesn't reside with the mayor. It might be under another body, maybe city council. How do we find that information out to be able to know how to target? You know, people may think they're voting for the mayor of this particular city that they live in because the mayor can do X, Y, and Z, and that's not necessarily the case. They need to be focused on this office over here. Or,
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Is it Levon?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Levon, for that great question. Yeah, there are as many different local systems of government as there are local governments. And for example, in the Twin Cities, we have a strong mayoral system in St. Paul and a weak mayoral system in Minneapolis. And what that means is the mayor in St. Paul has a veto over the city council's decisions, and the mayor of Minneapolis doesn't. So the mayor of Minneapolis is actually much weaker structurally than the mayor of St. Paul. Now, the traditions that go into why Minneapolis chose a weak mayoral system and St. Paul chose a strong mayoral system, it's a long history, and to really know that, you'd have to read some historical accounts of how each government came about. But in terms of who has the authority, say, over the police, the way to figure it out is through the city charter. So each city has a charter that lays out which powers which branch of government has. It's much more common for across states at the state level, so that there are much more commonalities between, say, Minnesota's state government and Wisconsin's state government. But even so, there are differences. And so really it's learning about how the locality in which you live structures their government, and that means reading the city charter. One very appropriate thing to do, and I've done this, but I did this when I first moved to the Twin Cities back in 1998, is to contact the city in which you live and to contact, typically it's a staff person in either the mayor's office or your local city council representative, and say, you know, I just want to understand the structure of government in my city. Who is responsible for what? Who is responsible for hiring the police chief? Who is responsible for establishing the budget? Who is responsible for, does the mayor have a veto? Things like that. And that's a perfectly appropriate question to ask of your city council representative. And to be honest, they may not know. I've had more than a few times when I've talked to city council members who actually didn't know their own, the city charter in which they were formally governing, but they know how to find out. And so I strongly encourage that, you know, depending on the city in which you live, to really ask those questions specifically about the kinds of policies you're interested in. I wish I could give you some specifics, but I'm not sure which city you're talking about in particular. So maybe you can drop that in the chat and I can answer that. I can answer that later.
Thank you. Actually, that was extremely helpful.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. But yeah, so we have in this chart of 9 different, and just if you could confirm, can you see my screen? Because I took it off for a bit. Can you see it again? Okay. So knowing which box to go to, and then knowing the structure of government in that box are really essential steps to take as you're thinking about whether it's trying to change citizen participation in elections, or if there's a policy like policing that you're interested in exploring, to really understand at the local level who has which responsibilities, which powers, at the state level to understand, and then if there's a role for the federal government at the federal level. Now, of course, knowing who sits in those seats is also important. And so the slide that won't stick is a slide about our US Senators, Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith. And we're going to practice some contact exercises in a little bit, but knowing who to call, who to contact is really essential. So knowing who your senators are, there are of course 2 senators from every state, knowing who those senators are, knowing who is your representative in the United States House. And what you can see here is a map of Minnesota and a blow-up of the metro area. And you can figure out which congressional district you're in. I will warn you that don't lock in this information for very long, because we are in the year of redistricting. And you might have some questions about how redistricting works, and I'd be happy to answer those. But redistricting will be done later this year, and that will determine the shape and the physical size of each of the 8 congressional districts, assuming, and it's maybe not that great of an assumption, but assuming that Minnesota continues to have 8 congressional districts. We're right on the cusp of losing one. We're one of the states that has a smaller population relative to the size of each congressional district. And it's possible that Minnesota would drop down to 7. There are states like Texas and mostly southern warm states, can't imagine why, but the southern warm states are growing and the northern cold states are shrinking. And so Minnesota is, we're very close to losing a congressional district. I think probably what will mitigate that the most is the fact that Minnesota did such a good job with the census, and I'm sure many of you were involved in that effort, and that actually increased participation rates significantly. So I think we'll probably be okay to keep 8 seats, but we will see later this year. Anyway, so knowing who your House member is a really important next step. Knowing your 2 senators, knowing who your House members, and then this is a map of the Minnesota House districts. So now we've left the federal part of the Federalist system, and we've moved into the state level system. And again, on the left is a state map, and on the right is a metro map. You can find out all of this information in terms of who your, let's see, well, another PowerPoint mishap. You can find out all of this information in terms of who represents you on the Secretary of State's poll finder. And if you don't know how to use it, I'll show that to you in a bit. But you can find out your district and therefore who represents you using that poll finder. All right, so I'm going to pause again and see if there are other questions. All right, hearing none, I'm gonna forge ahead. So we've talked about the powers that government has, but at the very beginning I mentioned that powers are limited, that we have a system of limited government. So what limits those powers? And there are 2 sets of rights. Rights of the people are those limits. There are what is often called enumerated rights, and then there are unenumerated, or sometimes described as penumbral rights. So I'm just going to ask you to drop in the chat, what are some enumerated rights? What are some of the rights that are listed in the Constitution? The right of assembly, the right to speak. Yep, those are both from the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. The right to bear arms is part of the Second Amendment, which follows a well-regulated militia. The right to due process, yeah. The right to religion. Good. Someone mentioned the right to vote. Interestingly, the right to vote is not an enumerated right, at least not explicitly. The right to vote is nowhere formally guaranteed in the Constitution. What the Constitution says about voting is that it can't be denied for several reasons. It can't be denied based on gender. That's the 19th Amendment. Can't be denied based on race or color. That's the 15th Amendment. Can't be denied for people who are over 18. And then can't be denied on the basis of a poll tax. Those amendments to the Constitution, which said you can't deny the right to vote for these reasons, never quite explicitly guarantee the right to vote. And as we've seen, certainly since a decision by the Supreme Court called the Shelby County decision, where a county in Alabama sued the federal government for the Voting Rights Act, since then we've seen a large swath of voting restrictions. And that has only accelerated in the past year. So the Constitution doesn't formally guarantee every American the right to vote. And if I were to say there's one area that we need to amend the Constitution, I know some of you work on other amendments. Vicki, I'm looking at you. There are other important amendments, but if I were to say there's one amendment that to the Constitution that is absolutely vital, it would be a guaranteed right to vote. Right now, the right to vote is what I would call an unenumerated right. And unenumerated rights are also very important. Can you think of any other unenumerated rights, or sometimes called penumbral rights? The right to privacy, Liz said, yep, the right to privacy. That's an important unenumerated right. Any others? During the debate over the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton worried that if they wrote down any of the rights, that some people would think that means that's all there is. And I notice that it's very hard for us to come up with rights that aren't written down, and which I think underscores his point. The right to travel or to move, transportation, not being held in a physical location, absolutely, that's a very important unenumerated right. The right to healthcare or well-being is another important unenumerated right. We might look at the right to safety or security as an unenumerated right. And there are many. And I think our ability to articulate enumerated rights more easily than unenumerated rights, the rights that are written down more easily than the rights that are not written down, I think is part of the challenge that we have as people who are trying to teach others about the Constitution and about our civics, is that we don't recognize the rights that we have unless they're written down too often. And just because they're written down doesn't mean we don't have them. And that's a really important fact about the Constitution. So I would argue we should fight just as hard for those rights that aren't written down as for those that are. All right, so we're going to move now in the presentation to talk about how to participate, to how to make this system of government work for all of us. And in some sense, this is the important part. It's not that what I've said before is unimportant. It's a series of facts that we need to know, but this is how to make those facts real. And I think I see there a variety of ways, and in my view, everyone should do all of them. Now, I know some of you, when you see on the screen run for office, you want to run for the hills. You don't have no interest in running for office, right? I see a lot of uncomfortable laughter, at least through my Zoom screen. Our system of government only works to the extent that people are willing to step forward and take leadership. And I used to run an organization in Minnesota called Progressive Majority. It was my job to recruit people to run for office. And I used to say I could sit in my office and not move a muscle, and I would recruit probably a dozen 35, 40-year-old men. Didn't take any effort whatsoever. To recruit women, to recruit women of color, men of color, to recruit people who hadn't run before and who didn't see enough of themselves in the people who were in office took effort. And so those of you who are laughing, and I respect that you're laughing, it's okay. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to embarrass you, but I want you to really think hard about why it is that you don't see yourself as someone who should run for office. Because we too often think that the people who should run for office look like the people who are in office. And we need to change that. And we need to start thinking about the people who are in office should be the people who are committed to making our country and our state and our community, our neighborhoods better. And running for office doesn't necessarily mean running for president or running for US Senate. It could be running for school board, or running for your neighborhood association board, or running for your town council. But it does mean being willing to stand up and put your name out there and just to say what you believe, to say what you think, and to let the voters decide. That was an aspect of ancient Greek society that we ought to continue. There are a lot of aspects, like slavery, that we ought not continue. But the idea that everyone had a role in both ruling and being ruled, governing and being governed, was, in my view, an absolutely essential principle that we should take. Mary, if you don't mind, if I just pull on your question, you say you don't have the skills needed to be in office. I heard that a lot when I was running that organization from people who were leaders in an organization like League of Women Voters, or who were great at gathering people together to have important conversations, or people who were willing to just sit in the background and work really hard. Those are skills that we need to be in office. Now, they may not fit necessarily with campaigning, but campaigning is a skill to learn rather than a skill that we need in office. And so I think we need more people who laugh when asked to run for office to start taking it seriously. And so I hope that one of the takeaways from tonight will be to give it some thought. Vicki would vote for you, Mary. I'm sure a lot of people on the call would vote for you too. And they'd all tell you, you have all of the skills that you need. All right, so how do you do this? How do you participate? How do you run? We're going to talk about each of the things. And the first thing I would say in how do you participate is to show up. You showed up to this event, that's fantastic. I know many of you show up to lots of events. I've seen several of you in a variety of events that I go to. But when you go to a meeting, a town hall, a meeting with your city council member or your mayor, when you go to a larger event, and obviously post-pandemic, we'll hopefully have larger events again, you are sending some important messages. You're sending a message to yourself that you matter to this democracy. You're sending a message to your neighbors that you care about them and that they care, and when you see them there, that they care about you. And you're sending a message to the person in office that you're paying attention. You know, one of the most effective things that I think we can do is to send a note of thanks to an elected official. Thank you for voting for the rescue package. Not only do they like getting positive mail, because often they only get negative feedback, but it also communicates to them that you're watching what they're doing, that you are aware. And there's nothing so effective as making someone notice. The people who influence the decisions made at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, all have one thing in common. They show up. So show up. And obviously you did that tonight, and you're going to do that hopefully more. You can always find schedules of events. Obviously this year, because of the pandemic, many of them are virtual, but every city council member, state legislator, federal member of the House or the Senate, they will have a public schedule, and they will let their constituents know when they're available. And if they're not scheduling events, then you and your neighbors need to organize an effort to force them to schedule events. All right, so we're going to do some practice now in how to communicate. Mira says your state senator has weekly office hours. Yeah, that's great. And they'll continue to have office hours when people show up for those office hours. And, you know, there's nothing as powerful as a story. And so if you, and we'll talk about this in a second, but most of the time they're simply looking for stories. When they schedule their office hours, they want to hear what's going on. Okay, so I need a volunteer. Anyone want to take that leap? I'm not asking you to run for president. I'm just asking you to volunteer on this call. Any volunteer?
I can volunteer. I'm not
Amy.
Yeah,
Amy, thank you. You're so reliable to volunteer. Thank you. Okay, so I have on the screen I have a script. And the script is for a simple phone call. Now you all might wonder why I have a phone call. Phone calls seem so 20th century, I realize. Why not a text? Why not an email? And here's how I think you ought to think about the communication that you as a constituent might have with your elected officials, whether it's a city council member or the governor or the president of the United States. It's obviously going to be hard to get President Biden on the phone, but making a phone call is harder than writing an email.
Mm-hmm.
And the impact of your outreach is almost directly tied to the difficulty it is for you to do it. Something that is really easy for you, where you just sign a petition that's sent to you by moveon.org or whatever, takes 5 seconds, will have no impact.
Why are there so many emails that ask for you to do that then, if there's no impact? It seems like I just get more and more all the time.
Well, it has a big impact on MoveOn and all those groups, because then they grow their membership. So what they're trying to do is grow their membership. And other things that they do, like, and I don't mean MoveOn in particular, but groups that send you constant solicitations to join a petition.
Mm-hmm.
The petition itself has no impact. However, if they raise money from that petition effort, and then they spend money on, say, ads or a voter mobilization effort in the particular state or district, those can have a big impact. But the petition itself doesn't have an impact. Mm-hmm. And so I want you to think about the time it takes you to do something. And the less time it takes, the less of an impact it will have. So the most impactful thing you can do is to show up at their office, or to show up at one of their events in public. If you take your time and energy and money and go somewhere physically, that's going to have the biggest impact. Of course, it's very difficult in the pandemic. So thinking instead about how to do a phone call. A phone call is not easy. It takes the time to get the phone number. It takes the time to decide what you want to say, and it takes courage, because you're going to be interacting with this person depending on who they are, either the elected official, him or herself, or a staff person who then convey it. And so I think it's worth practicing something that's not as easy. Many of us send emails or sign petitions. Those are easy things. I want to practice something that's a little bit harder. Okay, so I've written just a very simple script. And I want you, Amy, to follow it. You can you can raise any elected official you want, whether it's state or local or federal, and you can do it on any issue. And we're going to do it twice, and I'm going to give you some feedback on the first, and then try it again. Okay? All right. So.
All right. Let's see. Hello, my name is Amy Perna, and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. My zip code is 55108. And I'm calling to let Senator Smith know that I support the American Rescue Plan. Thank you so much for signing that.
Good. Okay, so I have some comments for Amy, but before I do, anyone else have any comments? What do you think was strong about what she just did, and what you think could have been strong?
Okay, this is painful.
I know, I told you it was hard work.
I like that you were brief and specific.
Thanks, Levon.
Yeah, I think that was Mary. Levon, did you have a comment
Yep.
as well?
I do. I like that you were very brief and specific. I also like the way that you identified, obviously, where you came from and what you supported. I think that one of the things that I would try to do, maybe if I had enough courage and didn't chicken out, was to explain why I liked the reason, their position that they took, that they supported or that they opposed, like how it impacted me personally. I think that kind of helps to drive it home a little bit. It rejuvenates them to let them know that, you know, this is a real life story, that, you know, what I did affected this person and their personal story.
Well, Levon, thank you for volunteering to be the next volunteer. So I can help you build your courage. I appreciate that. Yeah. I saw some people put this in the comments as well. I thought you were very calm. You didn't seem nervous at all, which is great. Someone else noted you were succinct, so you followed the script. And I haven't done it in a while, but I will go through kind of a month or two when I'll call every day. And like when there's an issue that's really important to me, I call a senator or state rep every single day, and I'll write down this script and I will follow it really carefully. And I'll often change the issue, and each day I'll have a different issue in order to try to really hone in to this senator or congressperson or even city council member that I'm serious about it. And the one thing I would add, which Levon nicely described, is the why. I support or oppose, in this case, the American Rescue Act because. You don't want to lose what's succinct. You know, think of this as maybe a 30-second message. You don't want to lose your momentum and the kind of focus of the call. At the same time, Levon said this as well as I can, you want them to hear your story. They want you want them to hear the passion in your voice. So do you want to try it again?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. Hello, my name is Amy Perna, and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. My zip code is 55108, and I'm calling to let Senator Smith know that I support the American Rescue Act because I see a lot of people in my community hurting right now, and I think that the income inequality in this country is our biggest problem, and I think that this act does a lot to alleviate that. Thank you so much for signing in.
Great. I
I'm
see
like
some.
sweating over here, you guys. This
Yeah.
is not.
Right. It's hard work, isn't it? It's hard work to, you know, and you're just practicing, right? And the kind of the pressure of the moment, you might stumble a little bit. It helps a lot to have a script in front of you. It helps a lot to have thought in advance what exactly you want to say. The one thing I would suggest is, rather than saying there are generally people in our community are suffering, I would name a person, not by name, but I'd be specific. You know, this will really help my neighbor who's struggling because she was laid off last year. Or I have 3 people in my building who have not been able to pay rent, and this is going to make a tremendous difference in their lives. Or, you know, my sister was laid off and has been collecting unemployment for the past 6 months and has no ability to pay taxes on the unemployment because it was used to pay her rent. And now the $10,000 tax credit, I guess, all the, I see, this is why I have to write it down, right?
Yeah.
But the $10,000 of unemployment collected in 2020 is now going to be tax-free. And that's a big deal for people who've been collecting unemployment. Or I have 3 children and I don't know how I could make it through the pandemic without the assistance of the child tax credit. And I'm so grateful that you've helped to expand it. Things like that, where you're really specific. Again, write it down. Again, prepare yourself with a script. And keep it brief. Like, I like, you know, the longer we go on in these scripts, the less likely the person is to listen seriously to what we're saying. The other important thing is stay focused on one issue. If you have more than one issue that you want to talk about, call twice or call 3 times. Call 3 days in a row. Don't make one call and try to cover everything. Because I actually, when I was very young, when I was 22, I worked in the US House. And my job, and part of my job, was quite literally to keep a tally sheet of the number of people who called for and against a particular issue. And that's all I would write down. They, you know, the tally, this was a tally for the American Rescue Act. And they quite literally will tell their bosses, yeah, you got, you know, 712 calls today and 61% were for and 39% were against. And that's the report that the senator gets about the particular bill. So keep it focused, keep it brief, and give them the information that they want. So Levon, you volunteered to be the second person. Can you unmute and try it yourself?
Okay.
You're such a willing volunteer. I appreciate that.
I don't even have any issues up right now. I spent a lot of time on the Minnesota legislature website and just made a list of all of the bills that are up for regarding elections. And
Okay.
I don't have that up right now. So I don't know any of them off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, that's okay. Just say the election bill. We'll know that you meant a number.
Okay. Whew. All right. Hoo-hoo dilly. Here we go. Hello, my name is Levon, and I live in Minneapolis. My zip code is 55430. I'm calling to let Senator Klobuchar know that I support your opposition to the bill expanding the requirement for voter ID. I know that there's a lot of people who have had difficulty during this pandemic, especially me, being one who recently moved, with obtaining a new ID with a valid address. And it took quite a couple of months, and I might have missed out on being able to participate in this past election. So thank you very much. I appreciate your support and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Levon. So I just put Levon on the spot. So feedback for Levon. What did you like about her exercise, and what do you think could have been different? Mira wrote authentic. It did sound very authentic to me. Other feedback? Beatrice says personal. Yeah, I agree. So, Levon, you had an interesting challenge. You wanted to tell Senator Klobuchar that you support something she opposes. So you agree with her in opposing something, and I think that it was the voter ID requirement. And yet, at the same time, you also support HB1, which is the bill, the voting rights bill, that would sort of change the structure of how we vote in the United States and would outlaw, for example, the voter ID. That's an important challenge, because what you want to say either is you support the bill or that you oppose voter ID. And those are, even though you're obviously, the way you said it was sort of correct, it was a little bit, it would have been confusing, I think, for the staff person to figure out, do you agree with her or disagree with her?
Okay.
So I would suggest, that like you, I oppose voter ID, or like you, I support HB1. Now, of course, that was a House bill, and so she's not yet had an opportunity to vote in the Senate. And so that's another thing that, might just take thinking through and talking to others. And, that particular call about the House bill might have been better to Ilhan Omar's office, just because she has a vote on that bill. Now, hopefully the Senate will vote on that bill too, although because of the filibuster rule, it's very unlikely. But anyway, I completely agree. You were personal. You had a great story. You were authentic. And the only other thing I would say is to have that script. I know you were on the spot here, but to have that script so you can be succinct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't mean this about you, Levon. I mean this in general. People get nervous talking to elected officials, and 80% of elected officials started off running for local government, and in their first run for office, they were people just like many of you. They were people who had never run for office before. There were people who were trying to figure out how to get involved. Walter Mondale once said to me, and I agree, that he asked, what's the difference between a city council member and a vice president? And I said, what, Mr. Vice President? He said, a string of good luck. Things happen quickly. Obviously, President Obama went from community organizer to President of the United States in an incredibly fast period of time. So it does happen occasionally, but most people in elected office start very local and then slowly and move up from one office to the next. And they all started in very much the same place you are. So they're human beings. They need to hear from their constituents. Believe it or not, they want to hear from their constituents, and it's our job to make sure that they do. And it's some of your jobs to run and to be one of those people. So I wrote some phone numbers down for Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith. These are easily found on their websites. Know them. There were periods of time when I've had them on my phone. I don't this minute, but have the numbers easily accessible. There's also some uniqueness to the Minnesota system when we're thinking about another way to participate. I know the League of Women Voters does a lot of work on this, but just in case it's unfamiliar to you, Minnesota is one of 13 states that has precinct caucuses. We're a caucus state, although in some ways we're moving to more of a hybrid between being a primary state and a caucus state. And precinct caucuses are coming up for municipal elections. So contact your political party and find out how to participate in the precinct caucuses for that party. Next year, we will have state and federal elections, so in 2022. I mentioned before the Precinct Finder. I know some of you have put in the chat how effective this is. If you don't know your district, go to the Secretary of State's office, type in your address, and you'll find your polling place or precinct finder. That information can help you then find out who your state rep is, who your state senator is, the local government, and of course the federal government. Some of you may know this already, but this is our primary and general election calendar for this year. The election is on November 2nd only for local elections. Next year, it will be for state and federal. As I mentioned, the governor is up in a year or year and a half, as well as Secretary of State, Attorney General, all the constitutional offices, the entire state house and state senate. There are no US Senate elections in Minnesota in 2022. So one of the things you might not know is that the Senate is divided up into 3 groups. There are 100 US senators. A third are in Class A, a third are in Class B, and a third are in Class C. And each class is on a 2-year cycle. So Class A is up for election in 2020, Class B in 2022, and Class C in 2024. And and every state has 2 of the 3 classes filled. So we have no US Senate elections in Minnesota. And then Heidi also mentioned that St. Paul has mayoral and school board elections this year. Yeah. Another fact that you might not know, but you should, is that Minnesota is one of 20 states to have same-day voter registration. Part of the reason that we have the highest turnout in the country, I'd say it's not 100% of the reason, but it's part of the reason, is that people can register to vote on election day. You probably know from League of Women Voters that in order to register, you can bring in approved documents, and they're listed on your screen. You can also have a person vouch for you. And that vouching process is part of our legal system of voting in Minnesota. And then finally, I wanted to mention again the importance of running for office. 25 years ago, people who wanted to run for office were basically dependent on their friends and family to raise enough money. They had very few resources. Now, if you want to run for office, there is a training for you. If there's a training for women, there's a training for students, there's a training for people of color, there's a training for labor union members, there's a training for seniors, there's a training for just about every group who's interested in running for office. And much of the trainings that I used to lead trainings for candidates, much of it is just practicing. It's just practicing giving a stump speech, practicing raising money, practicing being in a debate, practicing handling a crisis. And ultimately, what we have in the United States too often is people who want to run for office, run, and then later they figure out their values and they figure out what they care about. What we need more of is people who know their values and know what they care about, and then later they decide to run for office. So if you're one of those people who are centered in your values, know what you care about, I encourage you to be thinking about, as before, thinking about running for your neighborhood association board or your school board or city council or state office or ultimately federal office. And I would challenge you not only to think about it for yourself, but to think about who in your circle of friends and family you think should be asked. The research is that people who wouldn't normally see themselves in office need to be asked about 10 times before they say yes. So be one of the asks. All right, so I'm done with the formal presentation, but I have more time to have a conversation with you all about our political system and how to be more involved.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a question that from a little bit ago. I think I'll start with that. Cheryl Prentice is wondering, is the court the arbiter of disputed unenumerated rights? Is there any other body, and how have unenumerated rights been established historically?
Yes, the answer is that courts. The legislative branch will often try to establish an unenumerated right, so like the right to safety by passing a public safety bill, or all of our policing systems were justified or have been justified under unenumerated rights like public safety. Whether or not they achieve it is an important question we need to think about. But yeah, the legislative branch typically establishes those rights, and then it's up to the judicial branch to adjudicate whether or not those rights are found in the Constitution. So there's a famous case called Griswold versus Connecticut, which was a Supreme Court case in which the court declared the right to privacy. And in the majority opinion, the court said that in the rights that are enumerated, the right, for example, to free speech or the right to assembly, that those rights depended on other rights, and they were as present in those other rights as the penumbra is present in the moon. So if you know what the penumbra of the moon is, it's sort of the light around the moon. It's not the moon itself, but you can see a circle, a sort of a halo effect, and that's the penumbra of the moon. Sometimes it's thought of as a shadow, although it's not literally a shadow. But it's there. When you look in the sky, you can see the moon, but you can also see a penumbra. And that's as real, according to the court, or that penumbra is as real as the moon itself. And the right to privacy was understood as one of those rights. That, of course, became the justification for things like contraception. And it became the central argument for Roe v. Wade and the right to an abortion. The right to an abortion is also not an enumerated right, it's an unenumerated right. But that right, the right to control one's own body, was not argued under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, but rather was argued under the privacy unenumerated right. So that was a court decision. And I think it's fair to say that you can assert unenumerated rights in all kinds of contexts, whether it's a legislature or a president. But typically those assertions have to be adjudicated in a court. And so the first effort to establish an unenumerated right typically doesn't come from a court, but it's certainly where it ends.
Okay, there's another question in the comments. How does HR 1 and federalism coexist? Are we going to face challenges in court?
Yeah, so HR 1 is the bill that's trying to turn some election law over to the federal government, or the federal government essentially trying to establish election law that would, in some important ways, constrain what states can do. And I would say there's no question it will be challenged in court. There have been a number of federal laws, like, for example, the Help America Vote Act. The Help America Vote Act was passed after the Florida debacle in 2000, with the hanging chads, and I think most of you are old enough to remember that. And I talk to my students about that. They have no idea what I'm talking about, and that makes me feel very old. But after the election of 2000, where clearly such poor voting machines were being used in Florida, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which provided states with funding to improve their machines. There's also a military voting act that I can't quite remember the name at this moment, but required that absentee ballots were sent out sooner rather than at the very last minute to give military voters more time. Those have been challenged in court, and if HR 1 ever became law, it would absolutely be challenged in court. Having said that, I would say that election administration is increasingly a shared power, even if election law should be more, I think, appropriately considered to be a power reserved to the states. And how a state administers its elections is very much a federal issue because the federal government provides so much of the money. So I think that there will be court challenges, absolutely. And I think this is one aspect of federalism where in the future we may say we shifted from elections being purely state to elections being more of a shared power. I don't ever see elections being entirely run at the federal level. I don't think we'll ever reach a point where the federal government has one election agency and it runs all elections. I think we're too committed as a country to local elections and local governance, state elections and state governance. And I think that the benefits of federalism in that respect, in terms of making it much more difficult to hack it because it's so decentralized, will probably prevent any nationalization of the elections. But I do think we'll get to the point where there's more shared powers. But yeah, this is going to be a court battle for sure.
Thank you. Let's see. Julie's wondering if you can talk a little bit more about redistricting.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so every 10 years, the Constitution mandates that we count every person. And that's called the census. And despite some rhetoric that says that a certain kinds of people should not be counted, the Constitution is clear. It's counting every person. It's not counting every citizen, for example. And that means counting everyone who's here at the time of the count. That was done in 2020, as it was done in 2010 and 2000. And the count determines the population of every state. And we will know the count of Minnesota and other states pretty soon. Now, there are 435 members of the US House of Representatives. As a little trivia question, I'll ask you, see if anybody knows, what year did the US House change its size to 435 members? If you know, put it in the chat. And nobody can look on Google while we're waiting. No phones, no internet. Beatrice guessed 1959. Anyone else want to hazard a guess? The US House became 435 members in 1910. It has been 111 years. The population has exploded from about 200 million to, I'm sorry, well, I don't have the number right in front of me, so it wasn't 200, that was incorrect, but the size of a House district in 1910, so it would be 435 times 200,000 people. That was the population size of the United States. So someone can use their calculator. 200,000 times 435. That was the US population in 1910. Today, we have almost 800,000 per House district. In every decade from the founding in 1789 to 1910, the US House increased in size. And it froze in 1910 and hasn't changed since. And as a result, we have members of the House representing a district of people 4 times bigger than they did 100 years ago. Now, I would say that's a crisis of democracy and something that can and should be changed. But as a result, our current population, whatever the number turns out to be, let's say it's 330 million, 340 million, something like that. That number will be divided by 435. And there's one exception to that because there are some states where the population is so small, states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, where they only get 1 member of the House. But for all other House members, they're distributed by population. And that leaves Minnesota with either 7 or 8 members of the House. And if I can go back to that screen, so can you see my screen again? Yeah, okay. So this color coding is the 8 districts in the House. And our population has grown, especially in the Twin Cities. So the physical size of districts 3, 4, and 5, and maybe 6, will almost certainly shrink because they're more densely populated. And the physical size of the more sparsely populated districts, like 1, 2, 7, and 8, they will almost certainly grow. Now, exactly where the lines are drawn will first be up to the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate. They will each present a redistricting plan, which will have a map of the US House districts, as well as a map of the state House districts. And that's this map. They will not agree. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. The House is controlled by Democrats. They will not agree. As they didn't agree in 2010, they didn't agree in 2000, they didn't agree in 1990. When the House and the Senate are controlled by different parties, or they're both controlled by the same party and the governors of a different party, they cannot agree on the district lines. And so what has happened in each of the past several cycles is the Supreme Court of Minnesota creates a redistricting panel, and a group of judges create the lines. They're meant to be nonpartisan. They're meant to reflect some natural barriers like rivers, and we don't have mountains per se, but other natural barriers. They're meant to maintain county lines as best as they can, although in large counties like Hennepin County, they have to be divided. They're meant to not divide political districts, so to try not to split a town into 2 different districts, although sometimes that happens as well. So the redistricting process begins in the legislature. The legislative branch, both the House and the Senate, will propose a redistricting plan. They will not agree. It will be then sent to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and the Minnesota Supreme Court will simply declare a redistricting plan. Some states have nonpartisan redistricting commissions, and part of HR 1 is proposing making that a national requirement. I suspect that that's one of those sticking points that if it were ever passed into law would be challenged in a court, and any state that had a uniform House, Senate, and governor of the same party would probably resist that redistricting commission. Having said that, it's certainly necessary to end things like gerrymandering. So I could say a lot more about redistricting, but I see a hand maybe or two.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and I'm glad that you mentioned gerrymandering. I watched a documentary back last fall called Rigged, and it very much highlighted how immediately following the election of Barack Obama, this basically playbook was put into place to kind of prevent something like that from happening, and redistricting, gerrymandering went into overdrive. Very, very, I have to give credit where credit is due. They were very focused. They had a plan and they executed it. So my question is, what do we do to weigh in on that process, knowing full well that there's not going to be agreement? What can we do to make sure that the districts are representative of the people living within them and their, I guess, political ideology or whatever you want to call it? I'm not savvy with the terminology yet.
Sure.
I'm getting there, but yeah, what can we do?
So I want to be clear on a couple of things. Redistrict or gerrymandering, which is a concept originally because the district was shaped like a salamander, and the governor who signed it was Eldridge Gerry. And so the term gerrymander is a description of kind of the political mixing with the animal in creating a very long, skinny district. That process, the process of gerrymandering, is a terrible problem in a relatively few number of states. So in the states that have gerrymandering, like our neighbor Wisconsin, it is a very, very major problem. It is not a problem in Minnesota, and maybe in part because we've had split governance. It is not a problem in the Dakotas because they only have one House district, although it is an issue in their state districts. There are many states where gerrymandering is not a problem. In fact, a majority of the states, it's not a problem. But it's a major problem in a few states, in maybe about a dozen states. And so how can we stop gerrymandering? Well, I think there's two simultaneous, I'd say three simultaneous processes. One is supporting HR 1, and it looks like someone, Heidi, it looks like you put it in the chat. So contacting your senator or our senators, Klobuchar and Smith, and encouraging them to support HR 1. Now, the issue in the US Senate is not a lack of support for HR 1, it's a lack of support for ending the filibuster. And the filibuster is a Senate rule that requires that any legislative change, any bill, receive 60 votes to end this thing called a filibuster. And there aren't 60 votes for HR 1, so there are not going to be 60 votes to end the filibuster of HR 1. Tina Smith has said she supports ending the filibuster. Amy Klobuchar has been, I'd say she has been less than enthusiastic about ending the filibuster, although her rhetoric has gotten better over time. You know, Senator Klobuchar believes that the minority in the Senate should have the right to stop legislation if it's big enough, if it's a minority of 40. But HR 1 is never going to pass the Senate as long as there is a filibuster. So convincing the US Senate, US senators to support ending the filibuster is a really important step to getting HR 1 passed. That's part of it. Quite honestly, I'm not particularly optimistic about that happening, at least not in the very short term. And we can talk about why. The second thing is to contact people in the states where there is gerrymandering. So if you have friends or family in Wisconsin, if you have friends or family in North Carolina, in Texas, in Oklahoma, in states where there is intense gerrymandering, and working with them to help build and support organizations that are trying to end gerrymandering in their states. And there are organizations in each of those states that are actively trying to end gerrymandering. So that would be a very important second step. And a third step is to get involved in the effort to build political power across the country in support of the court cases. There was a case a couple years ago out of Wisconsin. There are several pending cases, all of which are trying to get the Supreme Court to rule that political gerrymandering is unconstitutional. Now, the court has said it is what's called a political problem, that it's a problem that a court shouldn't solve. It's a problem that legislatures should solve, and has therefore been unwilling to declare political gerrymandering unconstitutional. But that could change. And partly it might need to change by changing the makeup of the members of the Supreme Court, which will happen over time. But partly it could happen by simply changing the results of elections, because courts pay attention. And the Supreme Court is aware of the shifting public opinion. And if there was a large, well-supported movement across the country of people opposed to gerrymandering, the court would be more willing, I think, to rule against it. So I think that there are a number of simultaneous activities that we could all be in. we don't have a problem of gerrymandering in Minnesota, which is good, but that could change. If one party gets control of all three of both the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, as happened in Wisconsin in 2010, things could change very quickly.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a long-winded answer. I hope I
No,
addressed
that
the
was a great
redistricting
answer.
question.
No, that was a great answer. It just tells me I need to push my my focus out broader. So, in addition to making sure I'm keeping an eye on what's going on locally.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a giant dam with thousands of holes in it, and you try to plug one and another one opens up. And I guess what I would say is no one of us can solve what we might collectively consider the problems that we face as a country. But if we're all committed to doing our part, we will collectively solve those problems. So I don't think you, Levon, need to do everything. In fact, you can't. But as long as you're doing your part, as long as I'm doing my part, as long as we're all doing our part, I think that's what we need to do.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, it is 8, and I just wanted to stop for a second and say if you need to go, feel free to log off. I wonder, Matthew, if you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Mary is wondering what your thoughts are on, do we need more civics teachers? Talking to our youth.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always startled by how little some of my students know when they get to college from their earlier education. I don't know if that's as much about what's happening from the teacher's perspective as what's happening in the whole schools, where, you know, a social studies teacher may be doing it in front, maybe teaching civics in front of a room of 50 students who are just not an environment where they can learn. I think we need much greater investment in our schools so that we have classes that with fewer students and more teachers. And so in that sense, I definitely think we need more teachers. Do we need more curriculum focused on civics? Well, I'm biased, of course. I think everyone should learn this every year. And, you know, I helped to lead an effort called We the People Minnesota in 2016, 2017, or 2017. And what I said then and what I believe is that our democracy is only as strong as we are. And we have a responsibility to be civic students, and we also have a responsibility to be civic teachers. And so, yeah, I do think we need more, but I wouldn't say it should only be in the schools. I think it needs to be in this kind of environment. It needs to be in our neighborhood centers. It needs to be in our book clubs. It needs to be in all of the ways that we interact as supporters of democracy. And I think that, quite honestly, I think we took it for granted for too long. And we took the strengths, the sort of fact of our democracy as if it were fixed. And we're sort of living with the consequences of that inaction. But it's not, but our situation now is not fixed either. And so I think we can dramatically improve it, and sometimes very quickly, by reinvigorating this kind of work. So yes, I think we need more, but I wouldn't limit it to the classrooms, or I would bring the classroom out.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And I know, I mean, I recognize so many of your names, and I know that this is the kind of work you do. And so, you know, hopefully tonight is about reaffirming what you do and also giving you some more tools that you can use in your own work.
Absolutely. I think it was a great refresher. I feel like I relearned things that I forgot or things that I took for granted. So thank you so much for taking the time with us tonight. It was wonderful.
Great. Well, great to meet all of you remotely. Unfortunately, we can't see each other in person and do what we used to do, but hopefully that will return at some point in the future.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Good night,
Thank you. It was so good to see you all.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
I'll hang out if anyone has questions or wants to chat.
I have questions and I want to chat.
Woohoo!
See
I
you
don't know
guys.
if you guys have figured that out by now. I had a couple of quick questions. So I recently just reached out to League of Women Voters. I work for a rather large company here in, I work for Medtronic.
Okay.
And one of the things that we have is we have an African Descent Network employee resource group that recently started a government and policy committee.
Hmm.
And I raised my hand to be chair.
Good for you.
Yeah. So first time I've ever done anything like this. Politics is definitely a passion of mine. Being an African-American woman, just the legacy of what it has taken to get to where we are and understanding how precious that is and that it has been won by literal blood, sweat, and tears. And so one of the things we decided we wanted to focus on, obviously we have to be impartial, is to get people excited about and participating in these midterm elections. Everybody always focuses on the national elections that happen every 4 years. They look at,